The champion had never in his life needed a second grip, and the man whose shirt he was holding weighed 90 pounds less than he did. That was the arithmetic. 3,000 people ran in the same instant, and it was the wrong arithmetic, and the only person in the building who seemed to know it was the small man standing at the end of that enormous arm with a fist screwed into his collar and his breathing completely unchanged. It was a martial arts exhibition in the early 1970s, an arena full for one night, nothing officially at stake, which is the way these things always are, right up until the moment something is. The heavyweight had come as an honored guest, not a performer. He was one of the 2 or 3 most feared punchers alive, a young world champion still climbing, a man built like something quarried rather than born, and he had spent the evening at the edge of the floor with his arms folded, watching the demonstrations with the patience of a man who has never met a problem his hands could not solve. Beside him sat another champion, the whole world knew by his face alone, lean and quick-eyed and famous, there to watch and to lend the night his name. Neither had expected to do anything but applaud. Stay with this, because to understand why the smallest man on that floor was the most dangerous, you have to know what he had done earlier in the evening, quietly, without any spectacle at all. He had given a short demonstration, and he had not raised his voice or flashed his hands for effect. He had said, in the flat tone of a man reporting a fact rather than selling one, that strength was real and worth respecting, and that speed was real, and that neither one was the point, that the point was understanding where a man's power lives, so that you are never standing in front of it when it arrives. The crowd had liked it the way crowds like a clever saying, without believing it changed anything. And the young champion, watching from his chair, had liked it least of all, because to a man whose entire life had been built on the plain fact that he could hit harder than anyone in the room, it sounded like something a small man says to explain why he is small. So when the demonstrations were winding down, the champion stood and crossed the floor and did the thing that felt to him like good-natured fun and felt to everyone else like the temperature dropping. He looked down at the small man in the dark jacket, and he smiled, and he said he did not mean anything unkind by it, but that he had heard a lot tonight about understanding, and not much about what happens when a real man simply takes hold of you. And he reached out one enormous hand and closed it around the front of the small man's shirt, not lifting, not yet, just holding, the way you hold something you have already decided you own. And here is the first thing worth staying for, because it was not what the small man did, it was what he did not do. He did not grab the champion's wrist. He did not set his feet or lean back against the grip or do any of the things a caught man's body wants to do. He let his arms hang at his sides, and he looked up into the champion's face from a foot below it, with no fear in his expression, and worse, no urgency, the way a man looks at someone who has accidentally stepped on his foot in a crowd. And then he spoke, quietly, and the arena was silent enough that it carried to the back rows. "Let go of my shirt," he said. The first time. The champion smiled wider, because to him this was the whole joke, the small man giving orders from inside a grip he could not possibly break. He did not let go. He tightened his hand a little to make the point, and a ripple of laughter went around the near seats. "Let go of my shirt," the small man said again, the second time. Exactly the same words, exactly the same tone, not louder, not angrier, and that sameness was the thing that began, very faintly, to unsettle the people close enough to hear it, because a frightened man's second warning does not sound exactly like his first. This one did. It was the voice of a man reading a set of instructions aloud, and being patient about it, and coming to the end of the patience. Near the front, the famous champion in the open collar leaned forward in his seat. The young heavyweight had lifted and shoved and held a great many men, and every one of them had done something by now, struggled, laughed, cursed, given some human sign of understanding that they were caught. This one had done nothing but ask twice, in the same flat voice, to have his shirt back, and that nothing was starting to feel, to the champion, like standing in a dark room and hearing that you are not alone in it. So he did what strong men do when a small doubt touches them in public. He answered it with more of the thing he trusted. He set his grip properly, all of it now, the hand that had ended fights closing into the cotton until his knuckles paled, and he leaned his weight down into it to move the small man where he wanted him. "Let go of my shirt," the small man said, the third time, and then, because the champion did not, the small man moved, and stay with this, because the people who were closest spent years afterward trying to describe a thing that had almost no motion in it at all. His hand came up without hurry, and his fingers found a single specific place on the inside of the champion's gripping wrist, a spot the width of a coin, and his own body turned no more than a few degrees, and he breathed out once, short. He did not wrench. He did not twist the arm or bend it or force it anywhere. He simply pressed that one place and turned, and the effect ran up the champion's arm faster than the champion's own thoughts could travel, and reached the parts of him that decide below the level of choosing whether a hand may open or close or a body may step, and quietly told all of them no. The champion stopped moving. Not because he chose to. That was the thing his own face could not hide, and the front rows watched it happen to him, the sudden discovery that the hand knotted in the shirt would neither tighten nor release, that the great arm had become a bar of something that was not obeying him, that his weight already leaned into the grip, was now committed to a structure he could no longer adjust. He was not in pain, there was no pain in it anywhere, and that was the strangest part for him, because pain he understood, pain he had lived inside his whole career, and eaten and given back. This was not pain, this was a man his own size discovering that the machine he had trusted absolutely had a single switch in it, and that a smaller man had just found the switch and was resting one finger on it and would keep him exactly here, frozen and leaning and unable to advance or retreat, for precisely as long as he liked. The arena did not understand what it was seeing, only that the champion who had been smiling and holding a man off balance a moment ago was now standing rigid and still, bent slightly forward, staring down at a man half his size as though the floor had quietly turned to ice beneath both of them. And near the front, the famous champion in the open collar came up out of his chair. He did not shout, and he did not step onto the floor. He simply rose, the way a man rises when the thing in front of him has stopped being a joke, and he needs a clearer view, and more than one person would remember afterward that the most celebrated fighter in the world had watched 1,000 contests, and this was the one that got him out of his seat. The small man held it a moment longer, long enough for the champion to feel the whole shape of it, and then he spoke a last time, very low, meant only for the two of them. "You have my shirt," he said. "You were never going to have me." Then he released the pressure. The grip fell open of its own accord, the great hand coming loose from the cotton because it could now, and the champion straightened slowly, flexing the fingers, staring at his own hand, the way a man stares at a tool that has failed him once, and can never quite be trusted the same way again. And here is where the night could have curdled, because a proud man, humiliated in front of 3,000 people, will sometimes reach for the only answer he has left, and the champion had more of that answer than almost anyone alive. He looked at the small man. For a moment, the whole arena hung on which way he would go. He came again. Of course he came. One more grab, both hands this time, faster than a man that size has any right to be, all of it behind the reach. And the small man was not there. He had not stepped back. Stepping back gives ground and invites the follow. He had stepped in, inside the arc of those enormous arms, into the one place a man that big cannot fold his strength around you, and from that close he laid one open palm flat against the champion's midsection, at the soft place under the ribs where all the power in the world keeps nothing in reserve. And he did not strike it. He let it rest there, and he looked up and he let the champion feel exactly where the hand was, and exactly what it would have been. The champion went still a second time, and this stillness was different from the first, because the first had been done to him, and this one he chose. He was a professional to the bone. He knew, better than any spectator ever could, the difference between a man who is bluffing and a man who has decided, with his hand on the one place that ends everything, to be merciful instead. He had thrown that exact decision away in other men 100 times and taken the win. He knew what he was being given. The small man took the hand away and stepped back and did the thing that turned the whole night from a defeat into something the champion would carry for the rest of his life. He reached up a long way up, and he set the twisted collar of his own shirt straight, unhurried, and then he inclined his head, a small bow, the kind you give a man you respect rather than one you have beaten. He said quietly that the champion was the strongest man he had ever stood in front of, and that this was simply true, and that it changed nothing, and that both of those things were allowed to be true at the same time. He said that power like that was a rare gift, and that the only thing that ever wasted it was believing it was the answer to every question a man would ever be asked. And the young champion, who had crossed that floor to make a small man feel small, and had instead been shown, in front of the largest crowd of his life, the precise edge of the one thing he had always trusted, did not get angry. The people who told the story afterward always seemed surprised by that. But a certain kind of very strong man, once he has actually met the limit of his strength and found it did not break him, is freed by it rather than shamed, and this one had it in him to be that kind. He looked at the small man for a long moment, and then something in his face eased, and he began slowly to smile, not a performer's smile. He put out the hand, the same hand that had been knotted in the shirt, and the small man took it, and it vanished entirely inside the champion's grip, and the champion shook it with the enormous care of a man who has just that minute learned the difference between force and control. The famous fighter in the front row sat back down. The crowd, which had come for a spectacle and been handed something quieter and much harder to name, did not roar. It made the low, rolling, uncertain sound a very large room makes when it has watched something it has no category for and is trying altogether to work out what it saw. The champion lifted a microphone, and the voice that came out of him was not the booming one that had called the small man out. It was lower, and there was no performance left in it. He said he had spent his whole life being the hardest man in every room he had ever walked into, and believing that this fact answered every argument before it could start. He looked down at the small man beside him. Then he said that tonight, for the first time, someone had shown him that it answered nothing at all, and that he was grateful, because a man could go his whole life without ever learning that, and be smaller for it, however big he was. And then, with the smallest laugh, he said he was very glad this man had chosen to be gentle, because he had felt exactly where that hand was resting, and he understood now what it could have done. The small man left the floor the way he had come onto it, without hurry, without checking to see whether anyone was applauding. He passed the front row, and the famous fighter there said something to him too quiet for anyone else to catch, and the small man nodded once and kept walking, and was gone before most of the arena had finished deciding how it felt. Years later, the people who had been in that building would argue about the details, the way people always do, how hard the champion had really been holding on, whether the second grab was one hand or two, exactly what was said at the end. But the ones who had been close enough to watch a man 3 times ask politely for his own shirt, and watch the strongest hand any of them had ever seen refuse to obey its owner on the 3rd refusal, always told that part the same way. The hardest puncher any of them had ever seen had taken hold of a man half his size to prove that strength was the whole of the answer, and the small man had told him 3 times, without anger and without a blow, that it was not, and on the 3rd time he had made the champion stand perfectly still and understand it.